Just very quickly, hello to the audience that are here watching us, and I've just admitted Michelle, Kevin, Sydney, Alexander, and Natalie, and JT Moon. If you're not muted, could you just mute yourself? That would be great. Obviously, at the end of the session, you'll have the opportunity to speak to our esteemed panel and ask them a question or two. But to the people who are watching us on Facebook and on YouTube, hello. This is Intelligent Speech. This is our monthly kind of get together where we have a bit of a brains trust. We get some intelligent geeks, boffins, and just weirdos from around planet Earth.
Who are
And
you calling a
I
geek?
throw a topic out to them and they answer it. It works as simply as that. Um, 2020 is obviously going to go down in history as a year where everything happened. The whole world got turned literally upside down, and it's going to go down in the pantheon of years about revolutions and at least civil disturbances. It's going to go down in the same list as 1848, 1968, etc., etc. But the history, if we look at the Whiggish history of the world, which is one of just progress, it kind of glosses over the fact that there have been civil strife. Civil strife is the very grist of history, and invariably, the elites win out. But sometimes, and quite often, what the elites do, those in power, is they give a little fig of freedom or of progress to the people. And that's really what we want to look at here today. So we have Adam Vanami, and my friend and my mucker, as we say in England. By the way, Adam, a mucker is a good thing in England.
Okay,
All
good,
right, so
good. Thank you.
you are my mucker. We've
Mhm.
done many a podcast together. 10 American Presidents. He is my American friend. So Adam Vanami. And what's the name of your podcast that you do at the moment, Adam?
Yeah, so as you alluded to, I've been on a few with you with 10 American presidents, but I also co-host one called American Moments with my friend Matt Martin, where we go through key moments one in American history, one of which I'll be talking about a little bit today.
Fantastic. Emma Burnell. Now, we do podcasts together as well, don't we, Emma?
With,
Give everybody your credentials, Mom.
I'm a journalist and a playwright, and I may have just found out that my first ever play, is going to be on next summer. That's very exciting.
Congratulations.
Um, and I do a podcast with you called Mid Atlantic, and I have another podcast which is a monthly podcast looking at how popular culture covers politics called the Zeitgeist Tapes.
Fantastic. Maurice Smith, we only met about a month ago or so,
Yes,
but
that's correct.
what a meeting it was. You came on to Intelligent Speech. Let us know what your podcast is, sir.
Yeah, so I am the executive producer and co-host of Category is Podcast. It is a weekly podcast where my co-host and I, who happens to be my ex-boyfriend, we just talk about a range of different topics in pop culture, politics, music, news, anything that is happening in the world and in our lives today. So yeah.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Jamie Redfern. You, Jamie, are one of the first podcasters whose output I actually listened to. I remember it was a cold, windy evening in Toronto in about 2011. And I was listening to your Mancunian tone, sir, in tone about Hannibal. But what do you do now?
See, I've been podcasting for 10 years now, so I've touched on a variety of subjects. Started out with Romans and Greeks, had a spell doing the Middle East, and I'm now doing a series on American history called The History of the United States.
Fantastic. But by the way, when it comes to doing American history, I've got that. I've got the patent for that, the copyright for that. I'm the only Brit that's allowed to do American history. This is your panel, everybody, your esteemed panel today. And we're going to look at some famous rebellions, some famous civil disturbances, which have helped to shape the world as we know it today. Jamie, you start with the ancient world, so it's only right and proper, really, if we take a historical kind of sweep, that we can't kind of start with you. One of the most fascinating things and one of the most enduring appeals of Rome and Roman history is that it has so many parallels for us today. Roman society was sophisticated. I use the word sophisticated, knowing that can come off as a little bit first world, but it was sufficiently complex enough for us to take to understand it with a modern lens. You know, there were the elites who knew there were elites. There were the vox populi. There were populists. Give us an idea of where the Gracchi brothers sit with understanding power shifting from vested elites, people wanting more access to power, and then specifically with populism in ancient Rome.
Yeah, you're, I think, completely right. One of the enduring appeals of Roman history is there's always some comparison you can find. There's always an analogy there. It's where a lot of, I think, where at least Western thought comes from, is based on Rome. And the Gracchi in particular are fascinating. If you look at what's been called the Roman Revolution, which is the shift from the Republic to the Empire, a theory really popularized in the 1950s is that this was a grand arc that begins with the Gracchi, and that's where you can trace the fall of the Roman Republic to. It marks a huge shift in the way that the Roman Republic worked. If you look at civil disobedience throughout most of the Republican era, it's very peaceful, which you don't really think of when you think of the Romans. You normally think, oh, let's fight it out. But it makes you think of Gandhi more than anything else, how the Romans used to resolve things. If the people disliked what the elites were doing, they would hold what's been called a secession of the plebs, a secessio plebis, where the people of Rome would just leave the city. They would go on a 3-mile walk outside the Sacred Mount. They would base themselves there. That's how they got their political offices established to protect their interests. It's how they gained power, access to the consulship. It's what they did. But then things really changed in the mid-2nd century BC. Rome conquers Greece, it conquers Africa. All of a sudden, you've got wealth flooding into the Italian peninsula. While at the same time, you've got a struggling lower class. They're being displaced.
So Jamie, just quickly stop you. Why were the workers struggling? If there is this wealth coming into not yet the Roman Empire, you got North Africa for grain. That's what I always think about when I think about Roman history. All the grain always comes from North Africa. Why wasn't that wealth then trickling down into all sections of Roman society?
So what you'd have is most of Italy was severely damaged by Hannibal wrecking the peninsula. And rather than rebuilding, what happened immediately was the Romans went out a-conquering. So the farmers of Italy would leave, they'd go out and do the fighting, send the wealth back to Italy. The people left in Italy are going to be the upper classes. So what happens is, and the people left behind are like, it's agricultural based, they're farmers. And then all of a sudden Rome has access to Africa, it has access to Sicily, Sardinia. Grain starts flooding in and the market just drops out. All of a sudden Italian farmers can't sell their grain, they're not making money. So they start abandoning their properties, which is then bought up by the wealthy. So the wealthy start creating these huge estates, the latifundia, which are then farmed by slaves, which the Romans suddenly have from their conquests. So in the space of about 60 years, actually you can mark the point as about 163 BC, that the citizenship suddenly starts declining, people lose land, and the wealthy get super powerful. And that's the state of play when the Gracchi rise to prominence.
Fantastic, and a really masterful kind of like summary there. Adam, I know specifically the area of history that you want to look at, or the incident, is the Ludlow massacre. In terms of just the setup with the unequal distribution of wealth, How much of Jamie's setup with ancient Rome, circa 163 BCE, is analogous to the Ludlow massacres in the early 20th century in America?
Well, it's very similar in a lot of ways. I mean, history, Dan Carlin always says history doesn't repeat itself, but it kind of rhymes, right? In this case, it's very similar. Colorado, in the early 1900s, hadn't been a state for very long. It had been an organized territory. But similar to Carthage, it was, there was a lot of resources there that were being mined by the miners, gold, silver, and in this case, coal, because the steel industry was becoming a thing. The miners were being really, taken advantage of and not treated very well. And in this case, rose up against the Rockefellers, who were the moneyed elites in New York. So it's about as David and Goliath as it can be.
Mm-hmm. Emma, you're one of the kind of flashpoints in history which you said to me you wanted to talk about was Peterloo. And the Peterloo massacre seems to be following in this trend that we've already established, in that this is the working poor, striving for some level of economic equilibrium. But set us back into that post-Napoleonic phase, because obviously a lot of our viewers won't be aware of Peterloo and the resonance that name actually has with British social history. So Napoleon's now in St. Helena. King George is properly crazy. He's on his throne. Tell us about the setup for the Peterloo massacre.
I mean, it was basically a situation much like all of the others, where people who were already being oppressed and were actually not particularly radicalized by their oppression, something new came in. As you say, the king was a bit bonkers at that point. That's a British word for my American friends. And they brought further and further oppression onto those workers and made their lives harder and harder. And in some ways, it was almost a middle class. It wasn't the people at the very, very sharp end who rebelled at Peterloo. It was actually a more organised socialist middle class that then brought the workers with them, which is actually quite a classic pattern of revolution. It's quite often not the actual plebs who are revolting, but the people who lead them then bring the masses with them. But what happened was that they tried to have a very polite protest, and much as we've seen for the several hundred years that have followed, the police overreacted and went in very, very hard, and it became a complete massacre. And that massacre is now it's set up both the strands that followed it set up the cooperative movement, which is one of the most successful movements in socialist history, certainly in the UK, and also the more radical end of socialist protest in the
UK. Great summation again. Maurice, just to bring you in, if we're to look at the traditional narrative of American history, the traditional one would go something like some people came over on some boats, found some empty land. Whoops, there's one or two people here, but let's not talk about that. They worked really hard, sweated their brows and all of that. Needed a little bit of help. I don't know, we'll nip over to Africa and bring some help along. Then we got rid of the British because we didn't want to pay our taxes without any kind of representation. And then we fast forward to we realized that it's not nice to keep people in slavery, so let's let them go free. And then everything was smashing. So what are you going to be talking about today? Obviously, you're here as a proud American. What's your beef in this argument, sir?
Yeah, so in America, we love our protests, going back from like you said, the Boston Tea Party, where, people just didn't want to be taxed, and they just, took it to the harbor down in Boston. And so, yeah, I think as far as protests go, it's always about power. It's about the acquisition of power. If groups feel like they have not, reached a level of rights or power or visibility that the elites have, or it's about the reclamation of power. If you feel like your powers have been taken away from you, you want to get, those rights back, or it's about the distribution of power, where, everyone should be treated fairly and equally, and we're going to protest until everyone gets treated the same way. And, for me, being a Black gay man, the two protests that really stick out to me are the Stonewall riots, June 28th and 1969, which kind of kicked off the entire movement for LGBT rights and inclusion in society. And then even most recently, where we have the George Floyd protest, Black Lives Matter has, really come to the forefront in society today. And a lot of Black people, myself included, feel like, we're tired of police brutality. We're tired of, not being treated the same way as our white counterparts, where, we have police mass incarceration issues, people dying at the hands of police in custody. And, a lot of people are just tired.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we're gonna come on to fatigue later. Jamie, one of the interesting things which I picked up from Emma was she talked about the structure of how social change, and that can be social change in the traditional kind of wider sense, or revolution, or disturbance, or a bit of a fracas, that a lot of the times in history, it's actually not the plebeians, and it's great that she used that word, good Latin name for the people. It's not necessarily the plebs that necessarily voice that first. So give us an understanding of the senatorial class that the Gracchi brothers came from, and why was it that they, these aristos, felt the need for social change, and then what echoes historically has their populism had in, let's say, Roman history. So maybe we can touch on Caesar very quickly, and then maybe even with Arab history, because you did the Arab Spring set of podcasts. So give us a sense of these entitled, privileged, rich people. Why were they on the side of the great unwashed?
I was thinking that as Emma was talking, I was like, oh, this is the perfect setup, exactly what I want to speak about. Thank you, Emma.
You're so welcome.
You get roughly two groups of people. You get the group who who can recognize that there's something fundamentally wrong with the system and that it needs to be changed. And then you get those who say for the sake of it being changed, like in order to save the system, we need to change it. And you get those who want to use that opportunity to gain power for themselves. And the same impulse and which way that goes defines much of Roman history. The Gracchi, and why I think the Gracchi are particularly favoured by liberal historians, is that they're in the former camp. Like, they saw something was wrong with the system and they were trying to change it, almost to save the system, before the people did something crazy, like get rid of all these senators who don't seem to do anything good for us anyway. So the Gracchi, and for those who aren't that familiar with the Gracchi, there are two brothers, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus and his brother Gaius. Tiberius came to power as a tribune of the plebs, which was their office to protect the people, in 133 BC. And he offered a very moderate law, I think the Lex Agria, that would take the public land. So this is the land that the state held. And by law, a person could not own more than 500 iugria, which translates to about 300 acres. But over time, this has just been ignored by the rich. They just gobbled up land and ended up with the massive estates that I talked about earlier. So what Tiberius wanted to do is break up these massive estates, reimpose the limits, but expand them and say to the rich, okay, you can keep a lot of your land, you can keep up to 1,000, so that's double what you're legally allowed. You don't need to pay rent anymore. And the rest we're going to give to the people. We'll break it up into small chunks and hand that out. So that's fine and probably would have passed. But Tiberius was suspicious of the senators and he thought, oh, maybe they won't allow me to pass this because it goes against their interests. So rather than taking it to the senators, it was custom, because the Senate, interestingly, isn't part of the Roman legislative system. It's more like a consultative body of elders. So it was custom, like, oh, I'd take this law and I'll speak with the senators to see whether they like it or not. But rather than doing that, he went straight to the people. He took it to the assembly and was like, right, here's my law. Let's get this done. And that infuriated the senators. So they started trying to block it, acting against their own best interests, as elites often do. So they started trying to stop it happening. Tiberius got the law passed, and then he started to worry, like, oh, now that I've got this agrarian commission that's going to divvy up the land, I bet the senators are going to destroy it. So I'm going to take it. I'm going to be tribune again next year, which wasn't illegal, but it wasn't the done thing. So the senators assassinated him, which, shot themselves in the foot. The Agrarian Commission eventually managed to get done what it needed to, but it took about 10 years and was really not well done, and managed to infuriate most of the Italians in the peninsula, because Rome started to interfere with the other cities, which really annoyed the Italians and ultimately led to the Social War, when the rest of Italy rebels against Rome about 20, 30 years down the line. So that's one way of doing it. But then subsequent generations start thinking, hey, you know what Tiberius did, what Gaius did? That'd be really great, except how about instead of getting killed, what I'll do is I'll stay alive and I'll take power for myself. So you start getting people like Julius Caesar, who think, I know, I'll get lots of votes if I start trash talking these other senators. And ultimately, you get several people who start doing the same thing. You get these people who start operating outside of established norms. You get Pompey, you get Crassus. And ultimately, you get Mark Antony and Octavian fighting Actium, and Republic no more.
Republic no more. One of the fascinating things about American history is there's almost seems to be no other interpretation of it than the traditional one. And I'm specifically looking at you, Adam, and then I'm going to come on to you, Maurice, in that it's kind of what I said before. And one of the fascinating things about American history is the more that you learn about it, you hear that at the dawning of the Republic, there was Shays' Rebellion. There's been rebellions forever in American history, but it's not part of the collective narrative. It's not. First off, Adam, before we go back to Ludlow, why is it that Americans are so scared of their rebellious past?
Well, I think I don't think it's uniquely American. I mean, we don't like to talk about things that are ugly in our history. I mean, the British don't like to talk about the Boer War and things like that. But we have kind of an unhealthy.
I like this, Adam. I like this. You come on here to disagree with me and have a fight, right? Which is
Yeah,
very
exactly,
apt when
exactly.
looking
Sorry,
at the topic. But I'm gonna. You definitely have a point, but it's slightly different. I would say from a British perspective, in that there is the traditional, and Emmy could back me up with this, there is the traditional view of British history, English history, British history, there is. But also, it's seen as, it might not be seen as that as legitimate, but like Peterloo is very much the people against the establishment, and you know it is talked about, it is known. You know, the French are always rebelling and stuff, you know. So, but there is something about
And I
America.
think Guy Fawkes is an interesting example of that.
No, that's true. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we every year, one of our biggest celebrations is of a guy who tried to blow up Parliament.
Yeah.
And you know, we celebrate our rebels, I guess, more.
I think you're definitely onto something. I think ours is a little bit more romanticized and jingoistic a little bit, almost to a fault. I mean, I don't want to go down a rat hole, but I feel like we do celebrate some of our rebels, but the wrong kind of rebels, you know, like the Confederate, you know, monuments and things like that. But that's not for the same reasons. But Roifield, I do think, and I think that's where you're going, is we do kind of have more of a romanticized view of ourselves that, you know, those rebellions don't really line up with, you know, that worldview.
And so, okay, so it's the liberal era. It's the early 20th century. You mentioned the Rockefellers, and so tell us exactly what happened at Ludlow.
Well, you kind of have to go back so there's been a lot of labor unrest around mining. So mining is extremely dangerous, you know, as we all know. You know, for the average miner in a different country, you'd have 3 deaths per 1,000 workers, you know, per year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it really adds up. But in the United States, specifically in Colorado at this time, you'd have 7 deaths per 1,000 workers. Which basically means you're going to know someone who dies every day of the year across the mining population. There were children working, there were women working. The safety standards are god awful. In order to make the mine safe, the company isn't doing that for them. It's not like they're hiring people to go build a mine and make it safe. The workers have to do that pro bono in their free time, and they're not paid for that. And going back even further, to kind of go back to, we love our immigration stories as a country, and immigration is wonderful and it's awesome, but the Rockefellers kind of used it as a weapon in this case, because there was so much unrest that the previous owner of the Ludlow mine said, I'm out, I can't deal with this. So the Rockefellers came and scooped it up at 50 cents on the dollar, and they started recruiting not just in Colorado, not just in the United States, but in Mexico and different countries, to purposely get immigrants who couldn't speak the same language and thus wouldn't be able to organize very well. And then, you know, when you think of a mine or a workplace, you may think of a town where people live in the town and they go work in the mine. In this case, it's a very remote area, and they have what's called a company town. And us Americans are, you know, very familiar with the Pullman strike and what a company town is. But basically, what a company town is, it's a vertically integrated, controlled company environment where you're not quite a sharecropper, but you're a sharecropper on steroids. Everything is controlled and monitored by the coal company, where you live, the church you go to, the store you buy things from, even the money. You're not even paid in US dollars, you're paid in company script. So they have absolute control over your life. It's just becoming very, very unbearable. And they've been trying to, despite the best efforts of the company, the workers do end up organizing, and they go on strike, and it goes on and on. And I won't go in too much into the rat hole of how a strike works, but it becomes very costly. You know, at the beginning, the first 7 days of a strike, you know, you have the sheriff who everyone knows, who probably has been elected by the people who are striking, and they try to mix it up there and try to make everyone talk and come to some sort of agreement. But after that, the coal company has to hire their own mercenary army. You've heard of the Pinkertons, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's a different group called the Baldwin and Felts, detective company. But basically, what they are hired thugs. They're a mercenary army, and the reason they are thugs is because they're very expensive, and you have to provoke a conflict with the miners as soon as humanly possible. So once these guys go on strike, they're all kicked out of their houses. and so they're in a tent camp, and in the fall in Colorado, which is very cold. And so they bring in this mercenary army to fire machine guns over their tents every night, harass them, play loud music, and just basically harass them night and day to try to break their will. And so once they provoke enough conflict, it escalates to the National Guard, which then turns into a violent confrontation and a massive.
So Adam, how long are we talking about here in terms of the initial grievance? We're going to have a strike through to the National Guard getting called in, and then the massacre.
So the strike started in the late summer of 1913. So at that point, the workers get kicked out. They're living in this tent community near the mine, and then it goes on, and then the National Guard gets called in towards the end of the year. And then in early, it kind of becomes very peaceful. It gets to the point where the National Guardsmen and the strikers are actually playing baseball together the day before the strike, but the day before the massacre, which actually happens the day after Orthodox Easter. And that's another tension here is most of the immigrants are Orthodox or they're Catholic. And most of the guards and most Americans are WASPs, right? So there's that tension there too. So this had been going on for almost 6 months at this point before the massacre occurs.
Okay, Emma, Adam brought up lots of things there, and one thing that's definitely chimed with me was the looking at the town and how the bosses in effect didn't just own you when you were working, but had their own shops, the whole infrastructure was based around that. And obviously that was the early industrial revolutionary period in the UK. And I think one of the things that comes out of Peterloo post that is, and you mentioned it, kind of like the cooperative movement and benevolent capitalists trying to have model worker villages. But the other thing I was kind of really struck with, and it's the reason why I asked Adam as to how long was this going on, is that press, the oxygen of publicity, whether it is to dampen this thing, to say this thing didn't happen, or oh my goodness, this terrible thing did happen, or even just looking at the grievances, the press is actually really vital to this. So we have
that of course is why elites have always tried to denigrate the role of the press in public life. From more traditional elites to Donald Trump. Donald Trump's fake news line is a very extreme expression of "you can't criticize me, I'm president." It's what the president says is law, which I think was something that Nixon said. When I do it, it's not illegal because I'm the president. And the approach to public scrutiny of these elites has always, nobody does anything perfectly, and therefore there will always, whether they're doing well or badly, be something to criticize. And that's a big part of the press's role, is to be that critic, whether it's a friendly critic or an unfriendly one, or a neutral one, which is usually the best. But
going back to the early 19th century, how quickly did news of the massacre, and I forget how many people actually died at the Peterloo massacre when the yeomanry started killing the demonstrators, men, women, and children?
Oh gosh, now you're asking me. You ask me these questions, Roifield, knowing that I'm the only person on this that isn't a historian.
Okay. Well,
I know there were 60,000.
It was enough for it to be called a massacre as opposed to the odd murder.
It was a legitimate massacre. Yeah, there were a lot of people. There were 60,000 demonstrators, and there were a lot of people. That the crowd of 60,000 were charged into by inexperienced infantrymen. And this again goes back to something Adam was saying, where the local police were trying to keep, they had the relationships, they were trying to do the proper, almost what we would call now community policing. Mm-hmm. The National Guard, or the infantry as it was in the UK, stormed in and that's when it really kicked off and was a problem. But they wanted it to be a problem. You know, they wanted the visible putting down of a mob.
But the truth of actually what happened, and that this was fundamentally a peaceful demonstration, actually did come out. Maurice,
It came out, but I think that we are probably looking at it through very modern eyes. I suspect that the reporting at the time would not necessarily have reflected the way that we see it. And we are looking at it, and we take historical documents and then put our own interpretation on those. But I'm sure there were plenty of people at that moment who were fully in favour of the putting down of the mob.
Maurice, let's look at Stonewall. And I think in terms of how we construct, I use the word again, Whiggish, which is a slightly old-fashioned term now, but it's fundamentally that as history has gone on, there's always been progress. It's fundamentally a Whiggish view of history. Yes, there might be the odd little deviation, but fundamentally the arc of history bends towards truth and justice for all. And I always find that somewhat, and if you look at the emancipation of African Americans, that very much did play out. Yes, there is slavery, there's emancipation. Yes, there is Jim Crow. It goes back a little bit, but it's kind of incremental kind of steps forward. Whereas it almost seems that pre-Stonewall, gay America was completely and utterly ignored. So it almost feels like what happened at Stonewall was totally a pressure cooker. But could you just set us back to New York at that time? Because, you know, there is absolutely no way that in American media, the gay experience was ever televised, talked about, etc. Yes, there's going to be books and literature, but in terms of popular American media, being gay was utterly to be invisible, wasn't it?
To an extent. So part of the kind of stigmas and the different cultural attitudes about homosexuality at that time were very negative. And so people chose to hide. And, you know, people still do it today, but, you know, that part of culture at that time was like, I'm going to, you know, hide who I am. I'm going to hide, you know, being gay. I'm going to go to this secret, you know, clandestine club that's in the back alley, or, you know, I'm going to try to find, you know, my group of, you know, gay counterparts, but we're going to keep that, you know, very isolated. And we're going to go to this club, or we're going to go, you know, to this house and, you know, have these very almost secret societies, if you will. In the 1960s, you know, things were becoming more progressive as far as, you know, free love. It was post-war, you know, things that were going on at that time. And so the Stonewall riot, it was actually a riot. There was a bar called the Stonewall Inn, which is in New York, and it was being raided. And so the police would come in and just round up all of the people who were patronizing that bar and, you know, take them to jail. They would beat them and all sorts of other atrocities that would happen to them. So on that night, which was June 28th, 1969, I guess, you know, they came across the wrong ones, is what we kind of say. And so it kind of escalated. It was a powder keg, and it kind of just exploded into a riot. And people started protesting like the very next morning. And that's where all of the pride protests that are pride parades and celebrations and things that we experience today is because of those protests, those riots that happened the very next day. It was very quick organization, and people, you know, they were just tired of being oppressed and, you know, not being treated fairly. There were no protections for gay people at that time. It was also classified as a mental illness. And so, you know, at that time, people had just had enough.
And how did the press at the time remark upon Stonewall?
was a bit before my time, so I don't know quite all of the news stories, but it was. I don't think the press was that favorable. It was more like a, um, looked at kind of the police are going to squash this, riot, and it wasn't going to last that long, and it'd be over with, before you know it. But the protests and the riots lasted about 6 days, so almost a week of continuous, people standing up for themselves and their rights, and they didn't want to be oppressed anymore. So the level of kind of pride and celebration that we see today is definitely, it took some time to get to where we are. And we're still not as, progressive, in terms of what, what we might think, especially within the community, because there are different, hierarchies of status and power and elitism within the community, because you have your gay white man, kind of at the very top, because objectively you can just see that he is still a white man. Where if you go down to the very bottom of the structure, a Black trans woman, a trans woman of color, is probably on the lowest peg of that. And as we're protesting and fighting and trying to, like I said, distribute that power and that recognition equally, it's we still have a ways to go as far as everyone being treated equally.
I'm utterly fascinated by the perceptions of actually what has happened, and then how quickly elites change or react, overreact, dampen. And one of the things I've really been struck by, and everybody was, so it's not me having any kind of insight here, is in the Black Lives Matters protests after the death of George Floyd, immediately members of the police service throughout the United States said, no, we do not condone what this officer has done.
Right.
And it was very obvious that something had happened, that maybe this was just the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of people viewing police brutality. It was just another one more black man to die at the hands of law enforcement. I'm going to start with you, Maurice. How important has it been that the protests post George Floyd, even though people are saying Black Lives Matters, that they were a rainbow coalition in every meaning of the word? Does that then mean that society as a whole has very much taken on the angst of African Americans? How much of this is how much of this symbolism is really important? How much is this people just doing the right thing? And then how much then do and should law enforcement and elites then respond to that? And have they responded to that? Because obviously Black Lives Matters and the aftermath of George Floyd is still very much a live matter. And then we're going to try and weave in the other rebellions and flashpoints with kind of the same thing. How do the elites then react to this seismic incident?
Yeah, so I think in response to the George Floyd protest, I think it was hard for people to see, especially living in the culture and society we do today, where news is so available, and you could watch people live streaming it as it happened. And I think that combined with everyone was at home, and we're dealing with the pandemic, so everyone was very present and they could see what was happening in real time. I think for the protest, it was important that non-minorities got involved with it, right? Because leading up to that, we had the Breonna Taylor murder, which happened right before that. We had Ahmaud Arbery, which happened right before that. And you can just list and go on and name the names of people who had been killed by white police officers, or just white people in general. And I think it goes to say that we felt that this wasn't just about Black people. It was a moment in time where a lot of white people had to sit up, take notice, take accountability for systemic oppression that was going on in society and has been going on for generations, decades, centuries even, and really step up and say, okay, we got to do better. And, it wasn't just about, police reforms, because yes, that is what it's about. But, there are levels and hierarchies and structures in place that, systemically oppress Black people from birth to incarceration or the grave. And that, is kind of the pipeline is that we see as Black Americans. And, there were a lot of strides made after that. A lot of people did sit up and take notice. I think it was a big thing for American society for Joe Biden to pick a Black woman as his running mate in this upcoming election.
So here's the question to you then. How much of his pick, bearing in mind this is more of a history show, but that his picking of Senator Harris is definitely of historic importance. How much of that pick do you think was him his hand being forced because of the symbolism, and how much of that was real politique?
I think on some level, Joe Biden did probably think that if I don't choose a Black woman as my running mate, because he committed to picking a woman months ago. But I think at this time, because I really think he was probably trying to decide between Amy Klobuchar and I think Kamala Harris was probably the decision that he was weighing. But at this moment in time, he had no other choice. If he wanted to win this election, I think he had no other choice than to choose Kamala Harris. And that's not to take away from any of her accomplishments, or because she's a very well qualified, sitting senator. She was Attorney General of the second largest justice system in the United States. She was district attorney of San Francisco. She has, qualifications. So it wasn't just.
She has a very good resume. There is no doubt. Right, I'm going to bring you in, Adam, then I'll come on to you, Jamie, and then we're going to end with you, Emma, and then we're going to get questions in, because I know that we do have a lot of people here watching on Zoom, so they can actually ask questions. Labour history in the United States, as we kind of said before, Adam, is actually littered with a lot of massacres. But there has to be, the shedding of blood should never be something that we strive for to say, well, that was worth it. But what were the immediate ramifications of the Ludlow massacre? Did things become better for the American working man and woman? Did things just stay the same, etc.? People have lost their lives because they're striking for what we would see now as, pretty basic things. It's not as if they were asking all to have a Model T Ford and a gold-plated retirement at all, right? They just didn't want children to be working there and things of that ilk. So what was the immediate aftermath?
Well, before we get into the immediate aftermath, one of the things that was kind of unique about this one, and is kind of ironic that we haven't heard about today, was it was a media frenzy at this point because it was going on so long. There had been, as I mentioned before, protests, but the media was the strikers were very media savvy for their time and brought the journalists out. They actually brought Mother Jones out. I don't know if you guys know who Mother Jones is. She's Irish born. She's a labor advocate. Lost everything in the Chicago fire, was propped back up by, organized labor, and, came out, it rallied, the women, brought a lot of women out to protest, got a lot of exposure around the world, actually, at the time about this. But because back to the massacre, because it was so ugly, they machine gunned people, they burned people alive in their tenement city. There was a saying that all the miners, as many miners as possible, came to the funeral in a procession. And then it was said, I don't know if it's true or not, but at the end of the procession, they were handing out rifles to everyone who came. So it wasn't just a situation where you had 1,200 miners that rose up. It then, when it spread across the state, the Forbes mine was burned to the ground immediately after. 12,000 miners rose up, and over the next 10 days, 200 people were killed. And it was all across the state, very, very organized. In a lot of ways, it hardened the union. And unfortunately, in what you're asking about is, go ahead.
But that's an interesting point, because we hadn't actually got to the absolute death toll. So thank you for reminding me of that. Did that then delegitimize their grievances? Because I'm presuming that the powers that be, the state governor, etc., the head of the National Guard, can just basically say, we need to dampen down this rebellion, and then that can be dampened down, and then the grievances are completely forgotten about because these rebels, these murderous thugs, have been dealt with.
Yeah, actually, Wilson had to put it down. So he was president at the time, and he brought in the army from Kansas. So the state government said, we can't handle this, because you have to remember, this is the biggest uprising since the Civil War, or that we've ever had since. So you have 12,000 people outnumbering even the army at the time that came in. It was a really big deal. So Wilson came in and put it down. So the violence ends, but the strike doesn't end until December. Basically 6 months later. So it did delegitimize a little bit, but Maurice was talking about this a little bit. There's so much information, and for the time, they really couldn't whitewash it and spin it as the miners are the bad guys, because there was so much press there that knew what was going on, and they couldn't say it wasn't going on. So they did end up go ahead.
But what we could do is kind of forget that it actually happened. So it's always a surprise for everybody. I didn't know about Ludlow.
Yeah.
I only learned about the Tulsa massacre about 4 or 5 years ago. Where an incident where there is a race riot, and a race riot is just code for saying that white people killing black people. That's actually what it was. But we say it's a race riot. No. There's one side
quite.
with guns, and the shocking thing is about Tulsa, which is some 6 years after Ludlow, in the it's not quite the adjoining state, but a state very close, is that an aeroplane dropped bombs on American citizens. It's just utterly unbelievable. But I'm going to quickly go to what happens post, and we haven't spoken to you for a little while, Jamie, because I want to make sure that people can actually ask questions before we start to wrap up. So you have talked about how the Gracchi brothers and their reforms, and then the elites kickback, the senatorial class, leads to the decay of the Republic, and then with strong men coming to power, of which you have Marius, Sulla, Caesar, Mark Antony, Triumvirate, and then Octavian, Emperor, right? At what point did people realize that, the senatorial class realized that they had to do something to appease the people? Were there always heirs of the Gracchi who were trying to be populists without necessarily seizing power with the army behind them, or was that kind of some kind of romantic notion for you to have power in Rome and to be against the senatorial class? You needed the army. Was that the conclusion that people came to? Tell us about the thought process with other populists, other people that wanted to change the system, before we necessarily just walk into the realm of Julius Caesar.
It's very interesting how much Roman thought changes over that century or so, from the Gracchi to the empire. It's such a slow change, though. when we talk about some revolutions that can happen in days, like this is over a century, so there are a lot of different thought strands that interchange. So like the Gracchi starts as a land problem for citizens, which leads people to think that by taking that stance of supporting the people, they can gain prominence, and that does shift. I'd say during Sulla is the big shift from supporting the people gives you power to an army is what really gives you power. Because Sulla is a more conservative figure than the other great figures. Marius, more left-wing, the same with the Gracchi. Sulla is a conservative. He goes to conquer the East, he fights Mithridates, he comes back with an army. And the fact that he's the only one with an army means that he gets to decide how things are going to happen. He resets the Roman political system. He tries to stop people doing what he did. But the fact that Sulla, by having an army, could make himself dictator for life means that obviously everyone is going to see that. You do get other figures who try to copy the Gracchi later on. Claudius is a very interesting figure. He's operating around the 50s BC. So while Caesar's off in Gaul, he's fighting the Gauls. Cicero is probably the main figure in Italy. And Claudius tries to make himself popular by introducing free grain for the people, which is one of the issues that started off with the Gracchi, is the fact that people don't have enough food, they don't have money. So he introduces a state grain dole to people in Rome. Or I say everyone, but I of course mean free males get grain from the state. And that secures the people as a base. So what you then get when the empire rolls around is the army is what secures the empire. The Roman Empire is a military dictatorship, but the people are a nuisance. The dole is just a way to keep them happy. It's bread and circuses. Like, just keep them happy and they won't cause too much trouble. And that's a thread that you can see through much of history, is that people will sacrifice their liberty if they're comfortable. And a lot of revolution, I think the really interesting bit is that where you fall on that side of the line. Like, what is the limit that you can push people to before they say no, enough is enough? And it tends to be those moments out of nowhere that spark chaos. The fun thing, the easy thing about Roman history is I know how it ends. And speaking with other people here, it's like, oh, this is so easy. I've got all the answers. So it happened 2,000 years ago. But with something like the Black Lives Matter movement, you really don't know what's going to happen. Like, it looks like a tipping point right now, but if you'd have spoken to me in February 2011 and asked me, has the Middle East hit the tipping point when the man in Tunisia sets himself on fire in protest to the government there, and all of a sudden you've got riots across the whole region, but 3-4 years later we're back to square one. You just don't know.
True that. Emma, last word with you, and we're looking at the situation post. Would I be right and proper in saying that you can almost pin the start of the modern labour movement in the United Kingdom on the Peterloo massacre? Just give us a sense of how protests are dealt with afterwards. The great Chartist movement's going to happen after that in the UK. We in the United Kingdom escape 1848, all the revolutions in France. Sorry, not in France, in Europe, sorry. So just give us a sense of that and the early movements of labour and political representation, and then we can throw this out for questions.
Well, I mean, again, I'm going to use the caveat that I'm no historian. So the Labour Party was founded by a really interesting confluence of some very middle class left wingers who were the Fabians, a working class movement of the independent trade unions, and the then small group of independent Labour MPs who had managed to get themselves elected. And they banded together and they realised that neither the working class union movement nor the middle class intellectual movement could exist without the other. They needed each other for legitimacy, they needed each other for muscle. But what I've been thinking about while I've been listening to everyone else talking is the film Pride, which I don't know if everyone's seen, but it's a just wonderful, wonderful film about a group of gay and lesbian activists who decided in the 1980s, they looked at what was happening to the miners who were on strike in 1984, 1985 in the UK and in England and Wales, and said, we will support them because we have the common enemy of Thatcherism and Thatcher. And it struck me, because I love that film. I love that film so much. I could watch it every single day of my life. I cried my heart out the first time I watched that film. I also remember the first time I watched the film, because I've been involved in activism almost forever, and it's a story based on real people. And I remember thinking, why don't I know him, the main character in the film? I thought, why don't I know him? Because I've been around, I've met everyone. I've never met this guy. And then there's this moment where someone who is HIV positive, and in the 1980s, that was obviously a very different thing than it is now, kisses him. And you just go, fuck, that's why I don't know him. And that's who we lost at that moment. But what's fascinating for me about the film Pride, and looking back at it, is the battles that have been won since are the ones that capitalism were comfortable with us winning. So all of the battles for LGBT acceptance, and I don't say this with any sense that this was a comfortable or easy battle to win, or that it is won or that it is over, but they are ones that do not disrupt the capitalist model. The working class people in Pride probably have, if not the same poor communities, then worse. We never rebuilt the communities we absolutely devastated through the immediate destruction of the mining communities. And that, I think, is something that is an untapped seam in the way that we talk about that history. We look at that, the miners' strike, as a valiant but unwon battle. But we don't really talk about it in a class way anymore. And I think it's really important that comes back into our discourse.
Yeah, I think that's a point well made. And I think the one thing which I was kind of thinking about whilst you were answering the question, Emma, is that in many points, if you look at specifically at the French Revolution, what powered elites did was to co-opt certain elements of the initial revolution, whether it's just the iconography. We're going to use the tricolour because people have banded behind it, and we're going to use that as the symbol of state, which then we're going to use then to paper over the fact that necessarily not all of the grievances and the injustices we've meted upon the sans-culottes have actually been addressed at all. But like, we have the tricolour, it's our national flag now, we don't have a king anymore, etc., etc. Anyway, we've had a right royal little ding dong, as we say in England here. We've had a chat. We've had a little bit of a chat, but we do have a few people here watching us on Zoom. And the great thing is about Zoom is that it means that you can actually ask questions of the panel. So I'm going to quickly go on to speak of you. We are slightly running over. So if you have got a question, and specifically Kevin, you look like a man who's got a question within you. You're there chilling out, relaxed, tapping your tummy, or possibly even you, Meg. If you've got a question to ask to our esteemed panel, I would say now is the time, and quite simply unmute yourself and go for it. I don't know if Kevin's actually awake. I think we might have put Kevin to sleep. There you go, sir. I saw your eyes twitch there. Alexander, you've switched your camera on, so I think you're about to ask a question. But we only have about 10 minutes here, folks. So let's make sure that you use your time wisely.
Okay. So, hi. Thanks, everybody. This was a great talk. So my question is, a lot of the incidents we talked about sort of end quite violently and often, at least not successfully sort of immediately in the moment. Is there any common theme of off ramps that people could have taken so it doesn't end so sort of much of a bloody mess? And are those off ramps sort of reasonable things to expect, or is the off ramp like, oh, if only the elites sort of realized that it was in everyone's enlightened self-interest for them to sacrifice some power? I guess so the question is, were there chances to de-escalate, or were these things always going to end violently?
Whoever wants to take that up, you go for it. Just raise your hand and go for it. Emma?
I mean, it's a fascinating question, because the answer generally is the people with the off-ramp are the people with the least incentive to use it, generally. So those who are able to remove themselves well from that situation and find a way through are those with the power to change things. And why on earth would they do that? Is generally, unfortunately, their thinking, in my experience. Certainly that was the case with Thatcher and the miners' strike. She wanted to make a very, very specific political point that she wasn't going to be beaten by the unions. So there was no off-ramp for her there. In Peterloo, it was slightly different. It was more about ineptitude, but once that ineptitude had been let loose, it was very quick. And that then just had to happen because physically they had poured a bunch of angry, aggressive, inexperienced soldiers into a very small space and a very large crowd. I don't know, Adam, if there were better off-ramps in Ludlow.
I feel like there definitely were, and I feel some of it was just the Rockefellers' ambivalence to the bottom line. I mean, their biggest cost in all their operations was the bottom line. So I feel like it was very spiteful, kind of like Margaret Thatcher, because it's more about principle. And at the end of the day, they gave up a year of mining profits. And, for what turned out to be, a small recantation, at the end of the day. So, but yes, I think to answer your question, a long way of not answering your question, but answering your question is yes, I think there were some off ramps, but, I think, Emma made a great point that it's kind of on the people in power to use them most times.
Jamie?
One of the odd ways that I think about the history is not to sound too Whiggish, but there is a general sweep of history that you can see, and it's elastic. The more you try and resist it, it's going to stretch, and at some point it's going to snap. And the more you resist, it will eventually snap. And I think that's inevitable. And in most cases, the easier it goes, the less trouble you're going to have eventually. There are some situations where it's inevitable that it will go to violence, but in most cases, there is some sort of off-ramp, would be my take.
I think one of the incidences where it was pretty nonviolent was the women's suffrage movement here in the U.S. Because because I guess the optics of any violence against women at that time would probably not have been really great. The protests were mostly just parades. You had women who were dressed to the nines in their fanciest white garments. They had their parasols, they had their buttons, their signs, and it was, for the most part, nonviolent.
It's interesting how that compares to the British movement, which has the arson campaigns.
And it was a huge debate within the suffragists and the suffragettes, one of whom were violent and one of whom were not. And there was an enormous debate about the right tactics and whether violence was necessary and whether violence against the person was necessary. And we had someone throw themselves under the king's horse, famously. But more importantly, we had lots and lots of women starving themselves on hunger strike, being force-fed in incredibly abusive ways, thrown back onto the streets, going straight back into a protest and being immediately rearrested. So there were, the violence in the British suffragist movement was absolutely inherent to its success.
Emma, it sounds exactly like Mother Jones. I mean, she traveled all the way from Chicago by train to go down to this remote mining town, gets off, is beat up. I mean, they didn't, and by the National Guard, and they sent her back to Denver and said never come back. She gave them both barrels and came right back and was thrown in jail. But I mean, it's there's some really great stories.
Sorry.
Go on, Jamie.
I was going to say, A Death in 10 Minutes by Dr. Fern Riddell is a fantastic book on that subject, and I want to recommend it to all listening.
All right, we have
Difficult Women by Helen Lewis is well worth a read for lots of these struggles in feminism.
We have time for one more. So whether it's you, Meg, or Michelle, or J.E. Moon, or Kevin, you are awake, aren't you? You're not awake. You're shaking your head. You are nodding. Okay, great. Okay, smashing. Meg, looks like you've perked up. So the last question, the honour of asking the last question is going to go to you. If you can unmute yourself there, Meg.
Here I am.
There
Okay.
you go.
Yeah, I don't really have a specific question. I've been really wondering in current times, where are we going? With everything that's happened to make 2020 the shit show that it is, where are we going? What can we look forward to as we come out of this, hopefully with a vaccine and with a new administration in the US White House? Where are we going? What do you see coming forward?
All right.
What a great last question. Thank you.
I need exactly, because this is the question to launch another live Zoom session. So Adam Vanami, I'm going to start with you, but you've only got 30 seconds. Go.
Unfair. I think it's really easy to get down right now, and I'm guilty of that myself. It's really easy to be cynical. I think we need to, as Americans, specifically as Americans, we need to hold on to our institutions and seek out the good in our fellow man. And it's a struggle I have every day, because it's so easy to not look at it that way, and just try to look at things on a local level and be informed. And I do think it's going to be better. I think 2021 is going to be better. And we've been in situations like this before, not exactly like this, where we have overcome. And I feel like that's the way we have to look at it.
Emma Burnell.
Yeah, I think I want to slightly echo Adam. This is a horrible, horrible year and a horrible time, and has exposed all of the worst aspects of the way that human beings treat each other. So let's actually cling on to remembering the best aspects of the way that we treat each other. Take someone who you have a really fundamental disagreement with and find the love, find the part that you love about each other, because we all find something in each other that we can agree with. And that is the only way that progress ever really happens.
Jamie Redfern.
I think there is a lot of anger out there, and people seeking to divide us, when you can look at the global effort for a vaccine, which I think is truly inspiring, seeing researchers from all over the world working together for the common good of mankind. And it's proper inspiring to see, and gives you hope for the future.
Maurice?
Where are we going? I don't know. But I know that we can't go back to where we were. And I think there is a proverb that says you don't need to know where you're going to be headed in the right direction. And so I think that, there's a lot of uncertainty out there now, but hopefully we are going in the right direction.
I suppose the final word then falls upon me. I think, Meg, that if we're going to learn anything from 2020, it's that all of us, whether right or left, progressive, conservative, whatever label, for the last 10, 15 years since the rise of social media, we've all been within our silos. We have almost exclusively just spoken to ourselves. And it doesn't matter whether we think it or not that we have the monopoly on truth because our side says this and it colors the way that we view the world. We actually don't. It might pain me to say this, but not everything that Donald Trump has done has been utterly evil and fascistic. It hasn't, right? I do not agree with the vast majority of his platform, but it's beholden on all of us, left or right, black or white, gay or straight, whatever, to break out of our echo chambers, our silos, our emotional, political comfort blankets, and actually just speak to other people. It's as simple as that. And it will shock and surprise us all when we do that. As Emma says, how much we actually have in common with other people. A lot of the division and discord in society and in the world is because we don't understand why people have come to the conclusions that they have. It's not necessarily that you are wrong and they are right. It's just that you just do not understand why is it that somebody believes that black people are not equal. Why is it? And you know what? It's not necessarily an easy thing, but go out and go talk to somebody who necessarily you wouldn't day in, day out, break bread with and actually have a discourse with. And I think it's really important and incumbent on us all to have a civil discourse with people who we actually find objectionable and win them over with the strength of our arguments intellectually. And even if we can't, then respectfully then go the other way. But we've got to keep on doing that. We've got to keep speaking to our fellow man. And one of the funny things is for me, is that as much as I'm a podcaster and I create so many different shows, that podcasting in and of itself is not the reason why there's all this rancor in society. But actually, the way that podcasts are set up, they don't help the issue because we are just talking to ever decreasing amounts of people and reinforcing that every prejudice, whether that prejudice is right or wrong, prejudice is not a pejorative and whatever, because we can consume ourselves with media that just speaks to us. And as good citizens in 2020 and 2021, we need to break out and re-establish the commons where people of different stripes, different thinking actually come together. And as long as we have respect for each other, or at least we give each other dignity, right, I think the world would be a better place. Thank you for coming on to Intelligent Speech, everybody. Thank you for the people who stuck it out right to the end, who asked questions. Adam Vanami, tell us what your podcast is again, sir.
It's called American Moments. Matt and I have been on a bit of a COVID hiatus, but we're coming back pretty soon. But check it out. It's very nerdy but fun.
Smashing. Emma Burnell, who I'm going to see possibly on Tuesday. Tell us about your podcasting works again.
So my main podcast that isn't with Roifield, which is obviously my main podcast, is the Zeitgeist Tapes. It's a monthly podcast where we look at a different way that a piece of popular culture covers politics. Our most recent episode was on Mrs. America and the second wave feminist movement. But my very, very favourite episode, which you should all check out because it will change your life, is the one that we did on Dirty Dancing, the most political film of the 1980s. Did you not?
Jamie Redfern, is there a similar film from the 1980s that will color your view and your work looking at Hannibal, the Roman Empire, or even the Arab Spring?
The Empire Strikes Back, obvious choice.
Wait a minute, wasn't that late 70s? I think you're out.
It was
The
81.
decades are out.
It's 81, isn't it?
Oh, okay. Damn it. All right. Okay. Tell us about the podcast that you're working on at the moment, because I know you've muscled into my territory of talking about American history.
Yes.
Let that go.
So I'm currently doing a history of the United States. There are about 130 episodes so far, all covering the colonial period, because I'm moving at a snail's pace. Available at all good podcast providers.
Are you doing one a year?
Yeah. I think I've worked out I'll be finished by the time I'm about 140 or something.
Maury Smith, you have the opportunity to wrap this up in terms of what you're working on, sir.
Sure. So you can find my podcast Category Is at www.categoryispod.com. We're finishing our second season. We're wrapping up next week with our 100th episode. So you can find us on all podcasting platforms. And we're nominated for a People's Choice Podcast Award. In the LGBTQ category. So
look at you coming on to here bragging about your awards and everything, man. I've only been doing this thing for 8 years, never got a dicky bird off anyone, not one award. But anyway, folks, listen, thank you for being part of our Sunday, and let us be part of your Sunday, and talking about the people versus elites. I don't know if we've come to any strong and fast opinions other than just treat your other fellow humans with dignity and respect, and whatever happens in the future will not be a dark and horrible place. Take care, everybody. See you all again next month for another barnstorming, rip-roaring episode of Intelligent Speech at the Round Table, where I'll talk to some random podcasters and maybe Emma as well, and we'll I was gonna say put the world to rights. That's not quite true, but we'll talk about history and its relevance for today. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.